Yes, I can.
Perfect. If you could go to the next slide, please. We'll jump right in. Yeah, so again, Jeff Smith, want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today and share some of the work that we're doing alongside the Department of Energy, actually. This is an effort that we started off late last year, and the goal of this is to essentially take a step back and evaluate how we are planning and designing the distribution system today and how that should change given that deep decarbonization of the energy sector. That means increased renewables, increased electrification is right around the corner. In some cases, it's front and center in certain utilities. So if you go to the next slide, please. We all know that the industry is changing, right? We see it in time and time again with projections as it relates to electric vehicles, with certain targets for EV sales. We know the tipping points for certain technology adoptions once it, typically reach 5%, escalation factors increase. We know that in talking to utilities from around North America, around the globe, that electrification in particular is changing things at a rapid pace. So some utilities, they're anticipating, with a combination of either electric vehicles and or heat pumps, the changing load, just electrification in general, that in some cases demand is going to be increasing, is going to be doubling within a few years ago. It was in the next 25 years. Now it seems like it's in the next 15 years. And we're hearing that time and time again. In some utility, in some jurisdictions, what it took them 100 years to grow in terms of demand, they're doubling that in 15 years, which is unheard of. So in short, we know that the load is changing, our customers are changing. That means the actual the expectations are changing. So we need to look at the capacity for being able to deliver power onto to these customers. We need to focus on improving reliability, right? As customers rely on the grid more for their essential services, both reliability and resiliency have to be improved. But of course, we have to balance that all out with affordability and equity as well. We know there are these are some of the things that are changing, but we also know there are a number of challenges to get there. So if you go to the next slide, it's a bit of a sort of an eye chart, sort of kind of an interesting way of looking at some of the challenges. So we have to maintain affordability and reliability. So that's sort of our the two bookends, but there's a lot in between there. There's a lot to consider when you talk to distribution planners. Fast charging, the comment made about charge management and the role of distribution planning. So fast charging, charge management. How does that play into how I plan and build out the grid? My new system versus my existing system, my existing infrastructure. Where does non-wire solutions fit into that? Should I be upgrading now or should I upgrade later? What's the customer's role in all this? Are existing standards, new standards? What voltage class is going to make sense? What's my planning criteria? Do I need to change my planning criteria based upon the fact that demand is changing at a rapid pace, more rapid than we've ever seen before, and customer expectations are increasing? Time of use rates, too little, too big. There's a lot of things. So what we're doing is sort of taking a step back, considering all these factors, and essentially saying, well, we're going to have to consider that. We have to move forward. So we need to look at what we're referring to as right sizing the distribution system, looking ahead, but seeing what we could change now to meet those future needs. So that means right sizing is looking at right size, right time, and right place. So if you go to the next slide, I'll dive into that a little bit deeper. So when we say right sizing, what we really mean is being proactive and taking a mid to long-term look to identify grid service needs, the new designs that are necessary to meet those needs, as well as the operating requirements of the grid. All of that to enable deep decarbonization of the energy sector in a reliable and cost-effective manner. Again, keeping it within the bookends. So this means looking beyond our typical 2 to 5 year planning horizon, which, based upon your background, you may or may not know, most utilities, distribution utilities, are in the short-term planning horizon, because typically demand hasn't grown that quickly, and infrastructure could be built out fairly at a fairly rapid pace to keep up with demand. So there was no need to look beyond 3, 4, 5 years, definitely not out to 10, 15, or 20. So most have been focusing on the near term and then building out the infrastructure to meet those needs. What we're saying is that we need to start taking a longer look, 20 to 30 years out, and determine what we need of the distribution system in that future scenario, and then working our way back and asking that hard question, what do we need to be changing now that better sets us up for that 20 or 30 year out scenario? Now, could we continue to upgrade the system in a short-term basis, sort of incrementally, sort of as what we're doing now? Sure, that can get us there, and that might work in a lot of different areas where we're not seeing a lot of adoption of new loads or electrification is not coming on in full force, or maybe DER integration isn't as prominent as other areas. That might work, but in areas where we're seeing rapid growth, things are changing quickly. Our view is that we need to take that long-term look, a mid to long-term look, and see what that scenario looks like, and figure out what steps we can be taking to get there. And that's what we refer to as right sizing, taking a look at the future and seeing what can we do to right size the distribution system to meet those long-term needs. So if we go to the next slide, I'll break that down a little bit more, and then get into some of the things that we discussed in a workshop recently. So characteristics of a right size system. It sounds catchy, right sizing the system, but it's really what we're focusing on. So right size is right size, right time, and right place. So if right size, there's consequences as well of failure, right? If it's too small, we have degraded reliability, which requires further future upgrades. If it's too big, it's an underutilized asset, right? It's an underutilized investment, which increased customer costs. And obviously, right time. If it's too late, we have delayed customer connections, specifically for EVs, and declining reliability. But if it's too soon, we again might have an underutilized asset and increasing customer costs. And then, of course, right place. Wrong place, worst case, that scenario. So effective load forecasting, we've got it where we're going to have to work on improving and leveraging long-term forecasting and translating that to our short-term, more tactical 2 to 3 to 4 year, 5 year planning horizon. And of course, that has a lot of challenges. So what we did was we had, this is a project that we started off, we're working with the Department of Energy on it. Essentially, it's a workshop to gather information, and then from that, we're producing a white paper. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we learned from that workshop. So we met with about 17 utilities, coast to coast, different jurisdictions, different areas with different regulatory drivers, different adoption levels for technology across the large utilities, small utilities, munis, co-ops, IOUs. And we went through a litany of questions and discussion around what does it mean to right size the distribution system. So some of the key learnings we found from that, sort of high level, are on the left-hand side. Regional differences. Obviously, everyone was in a different region, and it completely had different expectations, different priorities, different regulatory drivers. But there were common problems even within that. So different EV adoption levels, different EV targets. In some cases, they were dealing with building electrification or enabling DER, or focusing on improving reliability, or focusing on improving resiliency, or simply improving efficiency of the distribution system. And then we also found that there are a wide number of practices and design standards across jurisdictions, and we knew that coming into it, but we discussed that at length. So in some cases, utilities are planning for 60% loading on an asset before they upgrade it, while other utilities are running it to failure, and that's when they upgrade. Some are using a 2-year planning horizon. Rarely are people getting out to the 5 or 10 year. Widely varying design standards, voltage levels. One utility had 4 or 5 different versions of 12 kV. And then transformer design, substation designs, widely varying practices. And then what we found was a lot of long-range uncertainties. around regulatory adoption as well as technology. So adoption, whether EVs or heat pumps, technology is growing in specific locations, but some of those projections for that growth aren't occurring yet in some jurisdictions. So what does a planner do with that? And then there's the regulatory policy and legislative changes that as a planner, with the stroke of a signature on new legislation in the state, that could dictate planning changes need to occur rather quickly. So how do you forecast that? How do you plan for that uncertainty? And then, quite honestly, aging infrastructure, legacy infrastructure. It wasn't just about. And one of the emphasis we had in the discussion was, it's one thing to build out a new system in greenfield, but a lot of the system is brownfield. We've got to actually consider that some of the assets that are out there have been out there for 50, 60, 75 years. Some utilities are dealing with aging cables and poles and substations that have 60 plus years. 4 kV is still out there. If you're familiar with voltage levels, 4 kV is one of the older voltage levels that was cost effective, and it was reliable and it was safe. Easy to work on, but doesn't have a lot of delivery capacity. And we look at some of these projections for EV adoption and building electrification, 4 kV just doesn't get us there. So a lot of utilities are trying to get rid of that and increase the voltages. So it's not just about expanding the grid, but it's about upgrading the existing grid. And lastly, a lot of discussions around, it wasn't just about the assets, it's about the resources. We spent a day and a half discussing what does it mean to right-size the distribution system and look to the future. And through the discussion, it was interesting to see that a lot of our planners were still focusing on today. They were fighting the fires of today, and it was hard to get them to think 20 years out, 30 years out. So resources to actually do that. And then the forecasts and the tools and methods to enable resources to actually leverage that. Those are things, critical things that are important that came out of that. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the specific things we talked about. Substations. Generally speaking, planners are like, in areas where we're seeing a lot of growth, we need larger subs and we need to standardize them. Transformers, we need them larger and we need to standardize on them. Standardization was more around trying to minimize the supply chain issues and lower the cost. So those are particular areas of standardization. Voltage conversions, that was a lot of areas where utilities are trying to either upgrade their voltage, like I mentioned earlier, 4 kV to maybe a higher voltage class, 15 or maybe even 25 kV. And then conductors, going to larger conductors. The designs, our system, we're going to have to move to a more sort of best practices around designing our system so it's more redundant, more reliable, N-1 capability. And it's not just about the assets, the wires, the subs, the transformers, but actually the monitoring control. Sort of leads back to the DOE paper that was mentioned previously by the previous speaker around more charge management. You have to have the monitoring and control of the distribution system to leverage that capability. So that means SCADA, AMI, ADMS, DERMS, foundational things that will allow us to better utilize those resources. And then lastly, the resourcing, the staffing that I sort of mentioned earlier. So from the outcome of this, we're writing a white paper. It's going to be published in the next couple of weeks. Sort of highlight some of these things that I'm sort of covering here. Goes into a lot more detail around some of the challenges, some of the things that we see moving forward. But this is the starting point for a broader effort and a broader initiative that we're focusing on here at EPRI. And if you go to the next slide, sort of summarizes some of that. It's essentially what we see as the pathway to right-sizing the distribution system. There's 5 key areas. I've highlighted some of these in the previous discussion, but design, modernization, and standardization. We've got to modernize what we're putting out into the distribution system. So identifying what asset sizes we need, and then we need to standardize on some of that. The second one is around investment strategies and planning criteria. We need to refine our planning criteria, come to consensus on some of that in certain jurisdictions where that might make sense, and develop the design standards for that, as well as the investment strategies. And then the third one is around policies and permitting. Identify some gaps and opportunities that support policies that enable the deep decarbonization for the system to be prepared for that, as well as the permitting. A lot of challenges are around permitting that can slow the infrastructure build out down. So addressing, what works and what's not working. Where are some of the areas that there are opportunities to maybe learn from other jurisdictions globally. And the fourth one is around stakeholder engagement, promoting transparency, both within utilities organizations so that everybody's on the same page, but also externally as well. And lastly, developing the workforce to enable that. And then the fifth bullet is a strategic planning framework. As I mentioned previously, we at EPRI, we feel like we've got to get away from that short-term planning horizon and develop and demonstrate a long-range distribution investment planning framework that is defensible and holistic, that utilities can lean into and leverage within their jurisdiction based upon their needs. So last slide was just a summary. You can jump to that if you want, but the steps towards deep decarbonization are becoming steeper, and we feel like at EPRI, we've got to take a hard look at what we can do better to equip us for the future so that we're not replacing infrastructure, so we're not making regretful decisions because the system is changing, the needs of the system are changing, and therefore the system needs to change. So I think that's I hit the limit for my time. So I don't know if there's time for questions or not.
Thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate that. There absolutely will be time for questions, but we're going to do questions after all three of the presentations. So everyone, hold your questions. You can either hold them in your head or you can type them into the chat. And we'll get to them all at the same time after the third of the three presentations. Next, we'll move on to our next presentation. This one is from Anthony Sandonato from LBNL. Anthony is an energy policy researcher in the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He conducts research on energy efficiency, utility planning, and electrification. Anthony also coordinates technical assistance for the National Community Solar Partnership. So Anthony, I am going to pass it to you for your presentation next.
Thank you, Commissioner Pertic. Can you hear me all right?
Sure can.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be speaking with you all this afternoon. Before I joined Berkeley National Lab, I was actually at the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, so a former regulator, and I like to bring a lot of that viewpoint into the research that I'm doing here. So today, we're going to be looking at regulatory challenges with the cost recovery for grid modernization. While this doesn't directly apply to transportation electrification, I think a lot of the outcomes and trends that we see in this can directly apply as you guys look at EV adoption. So next slide, please. So our agenda and takeaways. So currently we're looking at the cost recovery of proposed grid modernization investments. To do this, we're looking at what type of processes and utility filings are required, what types of grid modernization investments are being proposed, what's the planning process for developing investment proposals. And today's focus, we're going to look at cases where regulatory commissions did not approve proposed grid modernization investments or reduced recoverable costs. Some of the key takeaways from our research to date is, and I'm glad I get to be up here with Jeff Smith again, is distribution system needs and regulatory feedback are driving utilities to make grid modernization investments in a just-in-time fashion. We're seeing requirements for filing distribution plans appear to help in the investment approval process, and utilities that provide detailed and up-to-date information for evaluating investments seem to fare better in cost recovery proceedings. So next slide, please. So in order to get a full grasp of what's going on across the country, we've looked at recent investor-owned utility filings by holding companies with over $400 million. And the proceedings that we focused on started in 2020 with decisions in 2021 or later. And you can see we've looked at almost 40 utility grid modernization cost recovery proceedings. So next slide, please. So this is a busy picture, but the types of investments that we reviewed in this for this paper in this presentation fall into 6 categories, looking at automation and protection, monitor and control, telecommunications, applications and systems, data management, and planning and analytics. And what we've seen across the country is utilities are investing in advanced distribution management systems and other technologies to lay the groundwork to optimize grid operation. Like Jeff mentioned, a lot of the investment is going to this monitor and control as states are looking to as electrification starts to happen in states. Next slide, please. So for the cases that we're looking at here, we're going to highlight a couple different states. We've focused on New Jersey, Maryland, Illinois, Michigan, Georgia, Minnesota, and Utah. And one of the things that's interesting about this slide is it highlights different cost recovery mechanisms. And this is for grid modernization investments, but this could also apply to electrification transportation. Where are those investments going to be recovered? Is this through a specific rider for electric transportation? Is it tied on to a grid modernization rider? Or is it part of an existing energy efficiency rider? So those are some things that I'd be interested in. The other thing here is looking at the types of planning that went ahead of the proposed grid modernization investment. Next slide, please. And when we're looking at planning, there's various types of utility planning processes across jurisdictions. And for grid modernization investments, those really fell into 3 different categories. The first, where they are statutorily required, but not approved by the regulatory commission. So utilities are being transparent, they're showing their filings, they're allowing for stakeholder input, but the commission isn't adopting or approving them. Next, we see states where they are required, distribution planning or some type of process is required, and it's approved by the regulatory commission. I'd note here that sometimes just because a plan is approved, there's still a prudency review on the back end for additional cost recovery, but it allows for accelerated recovery of those investments. And the last situation that we see is if there's no planning requirements. And this could be the utility doesn't include a distribution system or investment plan, or the utility could include a plan that it derived on its own with its filing as a way for justifying the cost. Next slide, please. So what we've seen across the country is there's agreement about the need for grid modernization, but the biggest debate that we see is on the timing of the investments. So a couple of examples that I think really highlight this are the first in Georgia, the Public Service Commission, they approved a settlement agreement where Georgia Power, they chose not to move forward with a distributed energy resource management system, which was a reduction in 40% of the proposed spend. And this is interesting because even though it was a settlement agreement, the public interest advocacy staff advocated that the amount of distributed energy resources on the system does not warrant investment at this time. So this is looking at a timing of investment, and that directly could correlate to EV adoption, the timing of EV adoption in your state versus the need of the investment. Similarly, we found in Utah, the PSC, they disallowed costs associated with the field area network because this project, it wasn't completed. So it wasn't used or useful at the time that rates were being set. And then lastly, we saw in Illinois, the Commerce Commission rejected ComEd's multi-year integrated grid plan and required them to file with clear information on project designs, objectives, timing, and cost. So they found areas of non-compliance with requirements. So this ties, if your state has requirements for the filing, ensuring that utilities meet those requirements. Next slide, please. So planning requirements seem to help. The figure on the right is kind of an illustrative cost recovery process for grid modernization investment, but this could equally apply to transportation electrification. So first you have a utility who's able to develop a grid modernization plan. Then they're able to seek stakeholder or regulatory feedback. This can be done through a stakeholder process, or it could be done in a proceeding for a commission. Next, the utility will be able to incorporate the stakeholder and regulatory feedback and roll that into a cost recovery filing, showing that they're able to take in additional ideas from that process. And finally, there's approval of investments and direction on future plans. So this is a very important part of this iterative process, where as commissioners, you're able to provide direction on the utility planning and what types of investments they'll continue to make. So some examples where we see this, where regulatory commissions, they're aligning planning with the cost recovery process. In Minnesota, Northern States Power, they were required to file in their next integrated distribution plan whether or not integrated volt bar optimization was in the public interest. So initially, this investment was included in a distribution plan, and then when the company went for a cost recovery, they decided to take that investment out, and the commission was directing them to look back at it just because they didn't rule on it in the distribution planning proceeding. Another example from Minnesota is requiring the company to propose and discuss ways that the distribution planning process can inform financial and cost recovery issues in rate cases. So aligning the planning and cost recovery process. There's a lot of different initiatives going on in the utilities. It's important to make sure that all of them are flowing into one another and all the assumptions are consistent. In Michigan, DTE, they were required to include in their next distribution system planning detailed descriptions on strategies for grid hardening that were outside of traditional distribution system investment. This included the use of distributed energy resources, storage, energy efficiency, and microgrids. In Illinois, again, ComEd, they had to file a revised multi-year integrated grid plan to make sure that they were meeting requirements. Next slide, please. So the quality of the information matters. A lot of examples that we looked at in this, there were times where information led to either a reduction in the cost recovery or a disapproval of it. So the main concerns that we saw were outdated or stale cost estimates, no quantified benefit cost analysis, project targets that are out of line with existing utility distribution capital spend. Example, just really ramping up distribution system planning that's out of line with what they've done historically. You know, there's a lot of concerns that are expressed by its staff on the timing of those investments, staffing of getting those investments done, all areas that we heard discussed earlier. And then project justification not matching utilities planning assumptions. If a utility goes into a planning proceeding using specific estimates or a estimated load forecast that doesn't match up what they're using when they're coming in for cost recovery, that leads to some questions on where the variance is. And lastly, you know, asset replacement not tied to actual or imminent failure. So a couple examples that we see from this are the Illinois Commission found ComEd's proposal didn't provide sufficient transparency or detail regarding the location of grid reinforcement projects and cited potential duplicative costs. Again, in Georgia Power, they're required to report back to the commission in the 2025 integrated resource plan on development of DERMS and if they need to further system modifications for DER or electric transportation integration. And lastly, we saw the Michigan Commission agreed with their regulatory staff that DTE's high-level estimates, historical project spending, suggest significant uncertainty that the projected grid modernization costs will occur, and the company failed to explain how the costs cited range for other costs, so not justifying all of the costs included. Next slide, please. This is just a disclaimer. We can skip to the next slide. So for more information on this, I have my information here, but I also wanted to talk with you guys briefly about some upcoming work that would directly apply. And if you have any questions on this, you can reach out to me for additional information. The first one is we're currently reviewing electrification and distribution system impacts due to electrification. And this is a review of building and transportation electrification as a driver of distribution system costs. And to do this, we're summarizing current practices for recovery and cost allocation of those distribution system costs. We're doing a detailed look at 13 states and their utilities inside that reviews their current approaches, looking at what they're doing with line extensions, electrification incentives, how those costs are being allocated, if they're being to the single customer, cost causer, or cost customer class, looking at make-ready investments and the type of investments that are offered as participants look to electrify in the states. And then we'll also review the cost recovery and allocation of those types of investments. And we're going to highlight the pros and cons of the different approaches and explore how regulatory planning processes interact with electrification investments. And we are going to be looking at proactive versus reactive distribution system investment and what may be a better approach. Another project that we're working on is the least cost optimal distribution grid expansion tool. This is being done through the National Community Solar Partnership. So you may be asking, why do you want to talk about community solar here? Well, this model identifies the most cost-effective ways community solar and storage can be sited on the grid with a focus on minimizing interconnection cost, and maximizing deployment. We're currently partnering with 4 commissions and utilities to ensure that the model works well. And this offers us a potential to expand to additional distribution system investment evaluations in the future. So not just focusing on community solar. So thank you. That's everything I have today.
Thanks, Anthony. Really appreciate it. It's fun to know that someone's actually reading our orders that we write and able to understand and interpret them. So I appreciate you digging in and seeing, seeing the reasoning behind the decisions that we've been making at the commissions.
There was a lot of content there, and I appreciate you guys going into detail. So.
I think if I remember right, that particular order was like 500 pages or so. So I think you had a lot to go through there. So that was great. Really appreciate the deep dive into the different aspects of commission decisions. I bet that there's going to be a good amount of discussion about that in the Q&A. But we have one final presentation before we get to the speaker Q&A. So don't go anywhere, Anthony and Jeff. We still have one more, and then we'll get to the questions. Our final presentation today is from Cyril Brunner. He is the Innovation and Technology Leader at Vermont Electric Co-op, and has been with the Vermont Electric Cooperative for over 11 years, working as both a SCADA engineer and as a manager of engineering prior to his current role. He has a bachelor's in electrical engineering and minor in mathematics from the University of Vermont. So Cyril, take us away.
Awesome. And I'm actually going to share, I made some last minute changes. Sorry. So I'm going to share my version of the slides, if that's okay.
No problem.
Looks like this is working. Great. Well, appreciate you having me. I'm going to spend just a quick couple of seconds talking about a little bit of who is Vermont Electric Cooperative. What do we do in Vermont that allows us to innovate as quickly as we feel like we do? The proactive grid investments we're making, the modeling that goes into that. And then last but not least, what we're really hoping to do with managing DR to defer T&D investment, which is what I spend most of my time on. So quick overview of who is VC. We serve the northern part of Vermont. We have around 34,000 members, 87 megawatt peak demand. Our goal is to be 100% renewable by 2030. We have a lot of distributed renewables, heat pumps, DERs on the system, and we're very rural. We have about 1.2 meters per transformer, which I will touch on later, is causing us some issues as it relates to EVs currently. And we're a small staff, 109 employees, but because of that, we feel like we're fairly nimble and able to experiment in a quick way. So what about Vermont allows us to innovate so quickly? So one of the things that I'll touch on is we have some very forward-thinking utilities. Of course, I'm sure most of the folks on here have heard of Green Mountain Power, what they're doing. They're listed one of the most innovative companies in energy across the entire sector, which is quite remarkable for a utility to be named that. We We have Burlington Electric Department, who's a municipality. They're the first 100% renewable US utility in 2014. And, for us, in the technology space, we consider ourselves quite innovative. We implemented our first AMI project in 2005, which is quite early for the utility space. We also have really unique structure. So we have a statewide transmission-only company that was the first in the nation that's owned by all the distribution utilities. And we also have a statewide efficiency utility, which creates some really nice structures, some really nice collaboration. The distribution utilities, by and large, own some sub-transmission, but they do not own transmission assets. And because we are owners in Velco, it means that there's a lot of strong need to partner there. And then, last but not least, and probably most applicable to the conversation today, this regulatory alignment. So we have a Public Utilities Commission. We have a Department of Public Service who are the ratepayer advocate. VEC is regulated, unlike some co-ops in the country. We are regulated along with the other distribution utilities. And I'm going to touch on these three areas here: the innovation framework that we have, the Vermont System Planning Committee, and then also our integrated resource planning process. So as it relates to our innovation framework, this is a really nice carve out that we have, which enables us to run pilots. And this is especially valuable in the DER management space. These pilots generally run 18 months or less. They are very low impact to rates and kind of enable us to do innovative services. So we've used this for our smart buildings project. We intend to use this for some of the work that I'm going to talk about later. But in very short order, within several months, we are able to kind of go out and make innovation efforts, rates, procedures, whatever those might be. We also have the statewide planning committee. So that is actually coordinated by our transmission organization, Velco. We meet every quarter. The stakeholders include a variety of folks that you can see here on the left. It includes folks from the public. It includes some developers. It includes distribution utilities. It includes Velco. Sometimes it'll include the regulatory entities as well. And what's nice about this is that it's a kind of single place where we can talk about and plan out what's going on for the system. This came about as a result of significant amounts of transmission investment required in the early 2000s with a strong focus on non-wire alternatives. And so we have several committees that talk about that, and I'll touch a little bit on what we're trying to do as it relates to this here in a little bit. Integrated resource planning, nothing super sophisticated here, but every distribution utility in Vermont is required to file an integrated resource plan every 3 years. These are cross-silo conversations, right? They involve power supply, they involve engineering, they involve member services, whatever that might be. And we do this in close collaboration with the Department of Public Service. They create the requirements. They provide us with additional pieces of information that we need to look at on an annual basis. And it's very critical for us because any sort of substation or sub-transmission project identified needs to be identified in the integrated resource plan to receive a certificate of public good. So that's the only way basically you will get a substation and sub-transmission project in there, is if it's included in your integrated resource plan. That is now, expanding. We are looking further and further into the system. And just to talk a little bit about how VEC models electrification. So, I think the prior speakers touched on this, especially Jeff, of this kind of like near-term look, which is probably how we did things, let's call it 10 years ago. In the last few years, we've definitely, because of this increase in electrification, changed our processes a little bit. So in the kind of near term, we're using the data sets that we have. We're using our engineering model. We are reviewing that on an annual basis. We are also doing it for the integrated resource plan, but we are doing it on an annual basis, prioritizing where we need to invest, coming up with a capital plan, investing in the system. How do we improve this, right, is that we start leveraging the forecasts that our power supply department is doing, which can be influenced by state policy, our climate action plan in Vermont, or actual DER usage. So we are collecting data from chargers. We are collecting data from heat pumps. We are able to leverage those data sets, not just national data sets, some heat pump model in the middle of the country, but the actual usage that is happening in our territory, influencing the engineering model, which will then influence kind of where we decide to invest. And then that also gets influenced by the long-range transmission plan that Velco puts together. They put together a long-range transmission plan on that same 3-year cycle that influences what we're going to see on the transmission system, that might influence what we do on the distribution system and vice versa. So when it comes to impacts to the distribution system, I touched on the first slide that we have an 80 megawatt peak. We're anticipating a doubling of that pretty much. Significant load growth, which is good from a kilowatt hour sales standpoint, but from a grid infrastructure standpoint, we're really concerned especially as it relates to distribution transformers. You know, we have a lot of line that's been up since the 1930s. That's the reality of the system, is that that line is legacy put up when the co-op was first created and still exists. And that resulting peak load impact is around $100 million of grid upgrades, which for a small utility like us is quite tremendous, and even more at the transmission level. So just quickly, if we like look at what this looks like, you know, for us, and this was touched on earlier of these design criteria and things that we need to do. For us, the grid infrastructure is the foundation, right? We need to continually upgrade old wire, that wire from the 1930s. We've also increased some standard sizes, as was touched on. We do probably run, you know, our distribution transformers to fail. Those are not like assessed on a periodic basis. But we have increased that size to handle new electrification, especially from EVs. We're actively replacing a significant amount of legacy conductor, and we're leveraging data to do that, right? Data is the foundation for modeling in the future. And so we have a lot of good systems in place, whether that's our SCADA system that, you know, gives us data from the substation and transmission level, whether that's GIS, AMI data, those are all fundamental. And that really leads us into the virtual power plant space, which is where we're spending a lot of time, which is, you know, can we create these programs, these EV managed charging programs, battery programs, heat pump programs, to not only manage peaks from a transmission standpoint, but manage distribution impacts. And we really believe that we can save a significant amount of money by reducing the amount of impact on the system, right? This is talked about by Jigar Shah at the Loan Programs Office, by Jennifer Granholm at the DOE, right? This is the reality of what this looks like on the system. We know we can't eliminate infrastructure, but we can significantly reduce that by managing things like EVs and heat pumps. And so what we're trying to do in 2024 and this year, working with our partner Camus Energy, is how can we, this is an example of real data from the system. This is someone charging at 19.9 kilowatts for 2 hours, right? If we can find a way to manage that EV charging and decrease the amount that that person is charging, then we can eliminate the need for that distribution transformer upgrade. It's likely we will need to upgrade that transformer in the next 10 to 20 years because it's old, it's been around since the 60s, but we have so much investment that we need to do on the system that flexibility is incredibly valuable to us. And our goal is to take this sort of concept and apply it further upstream, primary line substations. We do not have EV capacity constraints at this level yet. That is anticipated to come. And then certainly at the statewide transmission level, certainly the regional level, ISO New England, there are constraints that are starting to show up in their long range plans. Those models, those sorts of issues can also be managed through this sort of EV management that we're trying to do. So that's our pilot for this year. Our goal is to file a regulatory filing, one of these innovation frameworks sometime in the summer. And then the work really will start happening in the fall and winter timeframe. You know, and it's, you know, twofold. One, make sure that we can get folks to sign up for this sort of a program, 24/7 management, and compensate them accordingly. And then the second piece is, you know, how much are we actually able to defer? Does this actually work in reality? So we're really excited to be working on that. So that's the end of my slides. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Sarah. Really appreciate that presentation. So we've come to the time for Q&A. So if Anthony and Jeff, if you guys could both come back on camera as well. And we'll have all three of our speakers available to answer questions from the audience. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or type them into the chat. I don't see any in the chat as of now. So if you have questions for any of the presenters, please feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll call on you and you can come up and ask directly. I'm going to just start with the first question, though, just in reaction, Cyril, to your presentation. For the data, first of all, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, is the importance of actually using all of the data that we collect from our AMI meters. And it sounds like this is one of those ways where you're actually doing that. You're collecting this data and then you're adjusting the system based on that real-time data that you're getting. And you actually mentioned that you collect actual data from heat pumps too. So I'm curious about how you distinguish like which is the heat pump and which is the system overall, or if you're communicating directly with the heat pump, or if you're just interpreting the AMI data. But what my actual question is, how do you actually then use this data to then validate these models that you build and make sure that your like the predictions that you've made are accurate, and then adjust them going forward. Like, is this an iterative process based on your data collection?
Yeah, those are awesome questions, and feel free to shoot me an email if you want to talk more about AMI data and those other pieces. I'm happy to chat about that after. We definitely we are not there yet on making an iterative process, but as absolutely our goal for our next IRP, which we are filing next year, is like we have a lot of kind of data models that are out there through statewide, through national labs, whatever, for like what a heat pump looks like, for what an EV looks like. Our goal for this next IRP is how do we take that actual data that we're collecting, ingest that into that model, create a better model, and then iterate on that the next go around when we have to do that, right? How can we take those real data sets to start integrating that in? So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, thanks. Eric, I think you were next.
Although, are we talking? We're not necessarily just asking questions for the third speaker, right? All speakers.
No, all three.
Okay, good. Because I believe it was the second that discussed the development of a tool for essentially. I feel like the way we're talking about distribution system planning here is that we're going to want software kind of like we get for generation when we've got utilities that plan, so use Aurora or Plexos, those kinds of capacity expansion software models. And so I'm wondering if you could point to, is there a gap in product availability for this kind of long-term capacity expansion software type modeling software for distribution system planning that you need to fill, or are you trying to make something better than what's out there?
I'm going to try to answer this the best way I can because I'm assisting with this project. And I think the thought behind this is a lot of times you're able to see distribution system planning come in, and the ability to have kind of a third-party software that's agnostic do this type of capacity expansion planning on the distribution system grid, similar to what you would do with generation, where you're looking at other alternatives as a way to defer investment, is what we're hoping to do with that. So it's a way of showing how you can connect existing projects that want to get on the grid at the least cost possible if you're looking at the whole distribution system.
If I could add to that, Anthony, if you don't mind, yeah. I would concur with what you just said. There are challenges and there are gaps as it relates to looking long-term. Long-term capacity expansion is obviously an evolved art for bulk system and integrated resource planning, right? It's still evolving, but it's evolved. The concept of doing that is still relatively new in the distribution space. So there are gaps as it relates to commercially available tools. We've worked with a few vendors and a few utilities to start looking beyond your short-term horizon, but there are challenges because around the further you look out for distribution, that cone of uncertainty is much wider. So what decisions do you make? So what scenarios are critically important to make those investment decisions, so you don't have stranded assets, that you can actually deploy something proactively before it is needed. So there are gaps. So that's one of the things that we're doing we're proposing to do and starting to do through an initiative to develop a long-range distribution planning investment framework that fits in similar to what we're doing on long-range capacity expansion planning, but focusing on distribution and the unique challenges that distribution faces, and that's around that uncertainty. Where do you put it? What do you do? When do you do it? So there's definitely a gap there for sure.
Al, I think you're next.
Good afternoon. I'm kind of curious. All three of you touched upon the importance of data, and I'm wondering, in terms of, there's a lot of information out there for EVs, and what is the best data that commissions should look at and use in their evaluations.
So we have we actually at EPRI developed an e-roadmap. It's publicly available. You can look at it on eroadmap.epri.com, and it leverages a lot of different data sources from working specifically with the actual the technology providers, the actual fleet managers, as well as the projections in different jurisdictions. And it's a map of North America that shows over the next, I think it goes up to 2035, what some of those projections look down to a very granular hex map that within every jurisdiction. So that's actually something that we've developed. It's free and relatively it's available now. So it's just eroadmap.epri.com. I can type it into the chat as well.
Yeah, maybe just to expand on that. Sorry, Anthony, you can go first. You're unmuted.
You got it, Cyril.
Okay, I was just gonna say, I think it comes down to the data that you have, right? We're fortunate, so we have a managed charging program that we did for peak reduction. So we have around 200 chargers worth of data. That data is fairly easily accessible through the vendor that we're working with. We also are running EV detection on our AMI data, which is often kind of where folks start, right? Because they might not have that direct management capability. And then, we're also working with a telematics vendor to talk directly to the vehicle. Those data sets all look a little different on resolution and time frequency and accuracy, right? So, and the telematics data, the EV charger data itself has data sets that the charger doesn't have, that the AMI set doesn't have. So we try and get as close as possible to the device level data in the most cost-effective way we can, which is often talking and communicating to the device itself versus through some metering or something else.
And the last thing that I would add, coming at it as a former regulator, would be looking at assumptions within the utility territory and ensure that they're accurate for your actual EV adoption rates, right? Some states you can't use regional EV adoption rates. And like Jeff was saying, the data on this is getting down to a very granular level, and making sure that it directly applies to the utility, I think is very, very, very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think data is just becoming more and more important in the utility world, and that's just increasing with the amount of complexity that we're adding to the system. We do have a question in the chat next. Cyril, I think this is for you. For the EV charging program, will VEC be incentivizing participants? And for the planned grid upgrades, how does VEC plan to recover those costs?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first one. We do have a charging program today, which is focused on peak management. Participants are provided an $8 a month bill credit. We do not do a kilowatt hour based rate. It's just easier for us to do a monthly amount that's fixed. So regardless of how much you're charging, as long as you don't charge during the peak times, you receive $8 a month. Dependent on, as we expand this program into the T&D asset deferral space, the grid management space, that dollar figure depends largely on the type of asset that you are deferring. And so that compensation will vary based on that. It might be different for a distribution transformer that's a certain size. A larger size distribution transformer might be more valuable for us to defer. A primary line, a substation transformer upgrade will likely be even more valuable to defer. And as a result, that compensation will be higher to incentivize participation in that. For the planned grid upgrades, we're going to recover those through rates. We have an existing capital plan that we have. We're looking to increase the amount of investment on the system to meet the goals of electrification that the state has. So that'll be covered through rates.
Thanks. That's great. I just saw that Jeff put the link to the e-roadmap, EPRI's resource on where concentrations of EVs will be anticipated across the US. That's in the chat there as well for anybody who's interested. I don't see any other hands right now, so I'm going to take an opportunity to ask another question here. So Jeff, you mentioned a lot of good solutions, I guess, for some of the challenges and issues that we're seeing across the country in terms of electric vehicles. Is there any danger in generalizing too much for the whole country, giving too much general advice to all of us to do the same thing? I mean, I think I could see, I don't see any harm in planning, right? I think that that's applicable to all 50 states. Do a good job planning because things are changing quickly, and I think that would make sense. But how hard is it to make further recommendations that are applicable to such a diverse set of adoption rates, of policy goals, of geographies, of temperatures, all of that, utility structures, all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner Peretick. It's so when we think right size, we also think one size doesn't fit all. So to play on his words a little bit, but we do think that planning criteria, design standards, when you decide to pull the trigger on a specific change on your system, we do think that will be driven by specific adoption rates and other drivers, such as where you're located jurisdictionally. What you mentioned temperature, the climate impacts. Where we're seeing, like for example, in the Northeast, where we're seeing a lot of heat pump electrification, that's changing the specific needs for specific utilities rapidly. So they're having to make those changes, but in other jurisdictions, that's not the case. What we're envisioning is that we can come together as it relates to common leading best practices as it relates to designs, planning criteria, investment strategies, but they would be dictated by specific drivers. If something happens, if you're in a specific jurisdiction where you're seeing this type of adoption, this is what you would do. But other areas where maybe you're not seeing much change, there's no reason to pivot, right? Maybe you're going to pivot later down the road, 15 years from now, but other utilities, they're needing to pivot now. As a matter of fact, they're feeling the urgency to pivot to something new. So it will be, we do believe it will be jurisdictional, be based upon specific areas where customer needs are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So very good. Thank you for raising that question and allowing me to clarify what we're thinking in terms of right sizing and coming up with common planning criteria. One size does not fit all for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that that's part of the value of this working group in general, is that we get a really wide variety of different opinions to all come together from commissions across the country and talk about the things that that affect our respective states. Because it's easier to to have those conversations with other similarly situated states or similarly situated utilities than the ones who are not. So yeah, I think that's valuable advice. I have another question actually for Anthony. So you talked about your research on the cost recovery for the grid modernization investments, and there were kind of two different parts to grid modernization. One was like you mentioned, bringing up, or actually, Jeff, I think it was you who mentioned, like bringing up the 4.8 kV systems to a more modern standard. We have an extensive 4.8 kV system that goes through most of our older cities in Michigan, including all of the city of Detroit. And we're running into some of those same issues with, trying to find the right pace of upgrading all of that infrastructure, because it's huge, it's extensive, it's a very, very expensive and large investment that will need to be made to upgrade that 4.8 kV system. But you're right that it's not set up to take on all of this new electric load. So that's one form of grid modernization, right? It's like kind of just making sure that the grid is able to handle the electrification that's coming down the line. The other side is like those like proactive investments to get ready for some of these new technologies and like these kind of more innovative, forward-looking, like the more not a need right now, but we're predicting it might be a need in the future. Anthony, did you notice any difference in those types of investments? Like, and like, is it the same guidelines for like those routine grid modernization investments versus the innovative grid modernization investments?
Yeah, so when I was doing the research for this, I wasn't explicitly looking at routine grid modernization investments, such as the
Okay.
upgrades that you spoke about, but I came across them. There's a lot of states that are running into the same issue. And the questions that I saw repeatedly from the commissions are the assumptions going behind driving that need. If they're realistic and actually what goes into it, mainly looking at load forecast and the utility assumptions there. But as for the more advanced grid modernization investments, what I've seen is it's the same thing. Like if you're looking at the distributed energy resource management system in Georgia, where a utility is proposing it, a lot of times staff or I would see questions from other intervening parties asking about the actual justification for this system and what they'll do to apply with it. I think you already alluded to one yourself with the drive that you have for AMI data and how utilities are going to be using that data moving forward. So it's making sure that they have kind of these benefits in place that will justify these types of grid modernization upgrades, whether it's managing DER or integrating more electrification. That's what I saw as justification and generally acceptance. So.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Anybody else who wants to ask a question? I can absolutely keep going. I think I could go for hours asking questions, but is there anybody else who'd like to jump in? Oh yeah, go ahead. Al, sorry. I thought you just didn't put down your hand from last time. I apologize.
No problem, no problem. I'm wondering, Michigan is just starting to try to figure out what should be in transportation electrification plan filings, and I'm curious from the panelist perspectives, are there particular states that are farther along in that process that you know that I should you know reach out to? I'm kind of curious where you think the you know the policy entrepreneurship lies.
I would say not directly related to this presentation, but in some of my other work that I was doing, we've seen that there's detailed transportation electrification but again, I wasn't directly focused on that for this presentation. So if you have a follow-up question, or you can email me and I'll try to help you out with that too, Al.
Anthony, your connection broke up like right in the meat of what you were saying. Can you just repeat that?
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I was saying I didn't directly look at that as part of preparing for my presentation today, but I've been working on the periphery of that, and I've seen transportation electrification requirements in states like Colorado, Massachusetts, and Oregon. And because I don't have them right at my fingertips, Al, you can shoot me an email and I'll follow up with you offline to try to get you the information you need.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, and sorry again, Al, for skipping over you. I apologize for that. All right, I'll pause for just one more second and see if anybody else has another question. Then maybe I'll ask just one final question, and then we can let our guests go and move to the closed discussion session. Okay, so I guess I'll ask one more question then. So Cyril, you talked a lot about these, you know, fairly innovative programs and ways of you know, collecting your data and ways of making your predictions and then ultimately making these investments in the grid upgrades. How do you work with your commission in Vermont? You mentioned that you're fully regulated. So how do you work with your commission in partnership on planning for these investments?
Yeah, so generally through some sort of filing, right? That's at least the Public Utilities Commission. We work like much closer with the Department of Public Service, right? They're kind of like the in-between almost. And generally, if the regulators will look to the DPS as like, hey, Are they on board? Do they think, as technical experts, right? Do they think that this general fundamentally makes sense? Because, you know, some of the PUC commissioners might not have all the aptitude on, you know, exactly all the details on all of these particular electric, you know, the technical side of things, whether it's the data or the actual upgrades themselves, right? And then, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of open workshops. I would say those work incredibly well. So we'll have, it's like open to any utility. And those conversations are often a great way to kind of like hear from what everyone thinks on the particular topic or the proposal that's coming out. Those have been super effective. And then, you know, any sort of written testimony resulting from those workshops are often just as helpful, because sometimes you might just not have the thought there in that meeting or the exact idea. So those sorts of strategies have worked well for us, or at least I found that at working at VZ.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we've done a lot of the workshops and technical conferences as well, and we found those to be really successful too. We did get one last question in the chat. So in relation to data collection, how significant is the participation of auto manufacturers, and can you point to any standards that are promising in the realm of data collection?
Boy, I'm sure Jeff will have plenty of thoughts on the standard side of things. I mean, I would say they're very important. One of the things that we found, especially in like the telematics space, so talking directly to the vehicles, is there are very many different types of ways that the OEMs get this data through Smart Car to us. There are some that charge for that data. There are some that do not charge for that data. There are some that charge for a month or a year for free. And that just creates like a lot of complexity, right? So right now our program is really focused on a handful of OEMs that are easy to work with. And there are OEMs like Ford and Honda and BMW who are trying to kind of work directly with utilities. For small utilities like our co-op, that is pretty much a non-starter. We just can't afford to be integrating with every single OEM ourselves. It's just not going to work for us. Perhaps that strategy works for larger IOUs. So yeah, that's been an area, I would say, a challenging space. I'd say the charger side of things has been much more open and much more easy to work through. But the EVs themselves and the OEMs on that side of things, I think are just kind of like, by and large, outside of Tesla and a handful of others, kind of behind the times and kind of trying to do things on their own, which really just doesn't work for us at this point in time.
Yeah, I would agree with what Cyril added there. It is an evolving area, and certainly one that we need, and not just specifically for EV. I mean, when you think about EV as a resource, we need to think about it not just for an EV perspective, but like DER. And so there are opportunities to leverage existing standards that are being used for DER and maybe can be adopted for EVs, and obviously acknowledging the differences there. But from an operational perspective, a grid operator doesn't just needs to know what what he or she is serving, what it's going to look like in the future, whether it's an EV or a heat pump or DER. The service has to be provided in a least cost fashion. I know one area that we're looking to try to do, and it's maybe not directly related to your question, but it's that interchange of information between the fleet owner and operator, the ones that are trying to electrify maybe the larger fleets or maybe the mom and pop fleets, but in terms of providing a handshake between them and the utility, something we're calling grid fast, which essentially lets a customer look up where they're located and gives them information about their local utility, who they need to contact. Maybe there's hosting capacity maps for that, but also lets them provide information to a common platform that allows that information about their plans to be shared with the utility. So it's a little bit of a information sharing from not an operational perspective, but from a planning of what you're anticipating to do as it relates to electrification, and whether or not who do you need to contact, where do you need to go, is there capacity on the system, are there incentives in that area, economic development in the area. So basically trying to bridge that gap and coming up with a common platform to do that. So somewhat related, but more looking from the planning perspective.
That's great. Well, thanks so much to all of you. Anthony, Jeff, Cyril, thanks really for your presentations. These were really fantastic. And I think our group was able to learn a lot from you. So we'll move to the closed session. So if the three of you would drop off, yes, thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
And then we will go to the discussion section for the last 15 minutes. So we have 3 questions that we sent out in preparation for this meeting today, and that we've been able to hear quite a bit of from our 3 speakers on these topics. So hopefully, between the preparation from sending these questions out beforehand, plus the information that we got from the 3 speakers today, we'll be able to have some good discussion around this. So I'll just open up all 3 questions at once, since we only have 14 minutes now to have this conversation.